Hello, good afternoon everybody, and thank you EMPA for the invitation to speak today. I'd like to start off just with my first slide, please. So as Rebecca said, I'll be talking today about some of my research with the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, and I would just like to start by thanking the rest of my team here, Matalena Tofa and Catherine Haynes. And this is a 3-year project that has been funded by the CRC and supported by our end users, who are mostly in the state emergency services across Australia. So next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of background about the project, it's really divided into 2 sections, although some of this work has gone on in parallel. So this work came about as a follow-on from an earlier project. You can see the image there. That was a report that Catherine Haynes and colleagues at Risk Frontiers completed on flood fatalities in Australia across quite a long historic period from 1900 onwards. And what that identified was that 2 of the main areas in which the fatalities were occurring were in either driving through floodwater in a vehicle or recreating in floodwater. And so we took this project forward based on looking at those 2 behaviours specifically. And what we were looking at, as well as obviously being researchers and trying to understand that behaviour better, was to really look at the implications for risk communication in this area. And that included everything from evaluating the flood risk communication materials that are provided by the various state organisations, but also looking to identify what the challenges were specifically for communication. And then this project ends up with development of national guidelines around ways in which we can help provide information for public communication around risk for these particular behaviours. And there's a link there to our website with the CRC where you can find more information about the project. Next slide, please. So over the course of the 3-year project, we've been undertaking a number of activities, and as you can see from the top two images there, we've been focusing on some survey work. So we've worked with the public and with the state emergency services around driving through floodwater, but also for the public recreating and entering floodwater for other purposes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the public survey in this short presentation today. And in this survey, we were looking at a combination of, as I say, those 2 behaviours, but also asking people if they could recall a specific event in which they had driven through floodwater, and then asking them specifically about the environment at the time. So what conditions were they, where were they, what led to the decision to drive through floodwater, what were they doing? So we were able to look at that one particular example in some sort of detail. And we also looked at recollection of flood risk communication. With the SES, we looked at driving through floodwater, but we didn't talk about recreating floodwater. Going back to the slide, the mental models work we did, this was really looking at this whole idea about experts and novices with regard to these sorts of how they view flood and how they conceptualize flood. So this is really where we got to dig into some of the detail and to start to look at some of the differences between expert and lay person's views. In the top right there, we've also been doing some experimental work looking at the acquisition of skill, essentially. So we're looking at how people use cues in the environment to judge the risk associated with water on the roads. And again, we're taking an expert and layperson view here, looking at our SES personnel and how they judge that sort of risk, and looking at the public and seeing if we can identify people who are better at identifying those cues, and if that can give us some insights into how we can train and improve the ability to judge risk in these situations. So next slide, please. I'm obviously just summarising quickly here a 3-year project, so I just wanted to draw attention to some of the outputs from the project. We're a group of researchers, so as you would expect, we have academic papers that are peer-reviewed that are available. There's some examples there. In the middle, we have our practitioner-focused communications. So these are both articles from AGEM, from the Australian Journal of Emergency Management, available freely for you. And I particularly draw your attention to the Behaviours in Floodwater paper, where we actually work with a range of different stakeholders from ABC and Council and our SES jurisdictions to look at some of the data that are coming out of our project and to try and work out how that could be utilised to improve flood risk communication in this case. And then on the right-hand side, we have a number of research into action, of research into practice briefs, where we've really summarised some of our findings into far more bite-sized pieces, and those are available on the website as well. And we've got a series of 6 of those around those activities I've just outlined. So if we could have the next slide, please. So I thought I would just take a few moments just to talk to you about what we've been finding in some of the public research. So the survey was an online survey. There were around 2,000 people that took part in this, and it was proportionally representative of the different states and territories. So we had you know, a range of people from all over the country taking part in this particular study. And on the left there, you can see the headline information really about driving into floodwater. So we asked people whether they'd ever driven into floodwater or been driven through floodwater, and then we went further on to ask them to recall a particular example where they could give us some more detail about driving through floodwater. And we found that 56% of people had driven through or been driven through floodwater, and as you can see here, 53% gave us further information about a particular incident. And I'm just showing you one example. So we gave people pictures of a car, asked them how deep they felt the water was that they drove through on that particular occasion. And the sort of profile you can see there is very typical of what we've seen both across our SES sample, but also within the public survey too. And as you'd expect, majority of people are driving through typically more shallow water, so 30 centimetres or lower is typical here for a large chunk of the population that's driven through floodwater. But as you can also see, anything up to sort of 10, 12% of people have driven through something far deeper. The other thing we did in this survey was we gave people a definition of what we meant by floodwater, and one of the key things there was the fact that you couldn't see the road surface. So regardless of the depth of the water, even if it was fairly shallow, it's still possible that the actual road underneath could be broken up and could be dangerous. So that was something we were really keen to try to capture. Going back to the slide and just showing you a piece of information from the survey again about activities in floodwater. So we asked people about whether they'd entered floodwater on land or in flooded rivers. So we asked 2 different sets of questions, and I've just given you an example here. And we found that 28% of our samples said that they had engaged in floodwater activities in floodwater on land. And that was at any point in time. So some of these events they could be recalling could have been a very long time ago, but it just gives us a slight indication of who's actually been into floodwater. And then we went further to ask about what they were doing when they were in floodwater. So in this case, we found that wading and swimming were the 2 activities that people were mostly engaged in the floodwater. But then, and more interesting for me, we then looked at why people were, in this case, wading. So I've just given you a breakdown of the wading data there. And I think, as you can see, one of the interesting things there is not only are people doing this for leisure and playing, which tends to be the way we think people enter floodwater like this, but you can see the multitude of other activities that people are undertaking, whether they were travelling to or from somewhere, whether they were actually in the process of evacuating, whether they were rescuing either property or pets or people indeed, or even when they're wading in to just see if it was deep enough or safe enough to drive their cars through. So again, just to give you a bit of a picture of some of the richness we have in the data here. So next slide, please. So of course, one thing that is the, I guess, the nub of the issue here is that despite all the advice and warnings we have, people are still entering floodwater. And of course, our public data is showing us that over half the population has been driving through floodwater. And even within our SES sample, when we ask about private vehicles, not to mention the work vehicles, we find very similar proportions of our expert people are also driving through floodwater. And of course, this is really interesting from the point of view of a psychologist, as in how we can understand this behaviour and what we can do in terms of communication. So in my next slide, I think we really get to some of the nub of this. And it's the case that in this case, the outcomes and the consequences for people if they drive through floodwater are usually non-existent. So if, as you can see here on the slide, really what we're seeing is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to rescues and understanding who's being rescued in floodwater. But you can see here that 90% of people in our survey who'd driven through floodwater had no consequence whatsoever. And of course, the challenge there is how do you communicate risk when there is rarely, if ever, a consequence. And I think in terms of reflecting on the data we have here, you know, we asked people for one incident that they could recall. So I assume in this data here, we have an underestimate in terms of the consequences because people will probably more naturally think about the more salient event they've been through. And we know also from our data that 60% of the people who've driven through floodwater had done it more than once in the last couple of years. So we know that it's a common issue. So the next slide. What we've been doing in the last couple of months is really looking at our data. Because we have a nice large data set, we can do some good statistics on this. So we've been using, with one of our team members, some machine learning to do some predictive data analytics and try to understand what factors are actually related to driving through floodwater. And again, this is done in the context of trying to work out, what we can know about people who drive through floodwater that we don't already know, and it gives us, I guess, some levers that we might be able to use to extend that reach in our messaging communication around flood. So as you can see here, we've got the demographic questions in there. We put those into our model. ARIA there, in case you're unfamiliar, is Accessibility Remoteness Index of Australia. It just gives us an indication of the location in terms of how accessible it is in terms of remoteness or regional or inner-regional. We had driving-related variables, as you would expect. So we know from some of the fatality data that people in four-wheel drives, for example, are more likely to drive and to die in floodwater. So we have information there about the size of the vehicle, the operation, which is that four-wheel, two-wheel, four-wheel drive, whether people had undertaken any advanced driving courses, an idea of how much people drive in any given week, and how they rate their driving ability. We had flood-related variables in there as well, so we included information about whether they'd entered floodwater for recreation, floodwater on land, and whether they were aware of flood campaigns, again to see if this actually predicted or could be seen to be associated with driving through floodwater. And then the final group of variables we had was around risk and perceptions of risk generally. So we have risk propensity, which is very general. And then we also used this sort of, I've got that insert there to show you some of the images we showed people. And we said, if you were confronted with this situation in a normal day in your vehicle you normally drive, would you be willing to drive through this floodwater? So we had a measure of anticipated willingness to drive through floodwater that we also used in our model. In the next slide, those red, the variables in red there are the ones that came out in our model as the ones that were predicting driving through floodwater. So it's interesting here what we have found as being particularly relevant to this behaviour, but also the things that aren't there that you might expect. So you may have expected gender to come out, but in the context of all those other variables, gender really wasn't something that was predictive. Similarly, the size of the vehicle and even the operation of the vehicle wasn't something that came out in this particular sample of people. So it's interesting to take a moment and think about some of those findings and some of the ones that are surprising in there and how we might be able to use those for communication. So just moving to the next slide. So I just want to use the remaining time to talk about some of the ways in which we are trying to communicate risk, or risk is being communicated to the public, specifically here about driving or entering floodwater for recreation purposes. And you're probably largely familiar with the two campaigns and approaches that are at the top of the screen on the left and centre. And these really are our core messages that go out to the public. If it's flooded, forget it. Never do this. So as you can already understand as communicators, there are a few issues here. I mean, on the one hand, it's a very clear message, and there's no sort of ambiguity in it. But for me, thinking about this, when I see if it's flooded, forget it, I want to know what is it. And of course, with our data now, we've got an idea of what these things are that people are doing. And it's not always just about playing, and it's not always about driving, and it's not always about recreating and cycling. So it's all these other things that people are doing. And of course, these give you opportunities to sort of reject the message, or at least not to take it on as being relevant to you, which of course is important in how people use that information. But I also wanted to make sure in this slide that I gave you some ideas and some indication of the other really positive things that are going on with risk communication messaging. So I'm sorry we've gotten off the slide, but on the left-hand side there, you'll see the 15 to Float campaign. This is Victoria's SES campaign based on good sort of research from Brantley Smith at University of New South Wales, where they've looked at flood water and how shallow the water could be to still float your car. So if you could imagine the length of a pen, that's approximately 15 centimetres typically, that's enough to float a small vehicle. So these are just new ways we're trying to get this information across. Bottom middle there, you've got prepare for your decisions to affect others. This is from Queensland. And again, there's been some really great research going on in Queensland in this particular area by Cara Hamilton and her colleagues. And they've helped to inform some of the campaigns they've been using in Queensland. Bottom left there is the area I live in, which is down in the Hawkesbury in northwest of Sydney. They've been using a combination of augmented reality and these billboards, these large billboards that are very much place-based around how flood has affected the area in the past and how people need to continue to engage with the risk. And then on the right-hand side, we've got a couple of just stills from some really good videos that have been used. The top right there is around entering floodwater for recreation. In this case, the tagline was, if you knew what was in it, you wouldn't go in it, which I think gives you a bit of an idea of what this is about. But for those who are still struggling, it was also called the Poo campaign by those in the know. So yes, that's some really, really sort of clever ways to try to engage with younger audiences here. Bottom right there is a campaign used by New South Wales SES in recent times, using some of the data from CAT and Risk Frontiers research around fatalities, and actually getting the people who were involved in an incident in a car to tell their own stories. So in that particular image there on the bottom right hand side, the guy in the picture is actually the guy who this happened to, and he's retelling his story and reenacting it and talking about the consequences for him about doing this. So this is the sort of information we've got that's going out to the public. As you can see, there's a real range. There's a lot more use of, as I said, augmented reality. I know in Western Australia and in New South Wales, that's being used as an approach. In the last couple of slides I just wanted to, I guess, give you a little bit more information about what we've found in the research around public engagement with risk communication. So this first slide just shows you, again, some data from the public survey. We asked people at the end if they could recall having seen any kind of official campaigns aimed at preventing people from driving or playing in floodwater. And we were interested in this one because we see information that comes from individual agencies about the reach of their communications. And in this sample, we found that only 40% could actually recall seeing any information. And then when we drilled down further to ask them what they could remember, that's where it became really interesting. So as I said, that if it's funny, forget it message is probably the most common and the most widely used. And it was the one that was most recognised by our, or remembered by our sample. But really, it was still only 16% of those who could remember the message, or 8% of our actual sample could remember if it's funny, forget it in any way, shape or form. So if you can see in the right-hand box there, these are some of the comments we had. And if we had something that we could see that people were trying to get to the message that we knew had been given, we gave them a tick for that. So, if it's flooded, don't do it. That was included here. So you can see that the actual recall of specific messages is relatively poor. In the sample there, you can see we've broken it down by state, and Queensland and Northern Territory samples were the best at recalling these messages, and there has been a lot of work done in those areas to promote this communication messaging. So that's really positive to see. Next slide, please. So of course, we're really interested at the moment, I guess, in thinking about this particular example here about the if it's funny, forget it. So it is never enter, is saying just don't do it, the best advice, because at the moment we know it's not being particularly effective in terms of, well, we know that people are still driving through floodwater, and there are a number of issues in this messaging. I mean, it tells us what not to do. It doesn't tell us or give us any advice about what to do in terms of how to take avoiding action or what we should do instead. And the images, the slide you can see there, some of those quotes are coming from the mental models work, where we've been able to dig down more deeply with experts and talk about what some of these issues are. So again, just using this as one example, we've got others here, but I'm just using this as our example. There are some real dilemmas here, dilemmas for organisations that are responsible for public safety, knowing that driving through floodwater is dangerous at any level, even if it's shallow, the surface could be damaged and it still could be a really dangerous situation. So it's easy to just say don't do it. But of course, if people are not taking notice of those messages, continue to do it, and by and large they're getting away without any consequences, it's really hard to know if that's really being effective. And so, these quotes here are really getting at some of the issues that there are there in that sort of dilemma about how do we have a conversation about this if really our main message is just don't do it, and that's the easiest message to give people. So I'm just going to leave that with you a bit. One more slide. I was asked to reflect, I guess, on what we've been doing in this project, and I get an opportunity to show up one of my holiday slides from Norway, which I managed to fit in pre-COVID. Just again to talk about the rather corny reflection idea here. But I think one of the things that's come out from the project, probably not surprising to those who really work in this area, as professionals, it's just how difficult this is. I mean, difficult from the point of view of the number of issues that there are here. So there's a whole lot of issues around definitions. One person's puddle is another person's flood. If you're living in the Clarence Valley, like our previous speaker, if you close the roads every time there's a bit of water on the road, it could be a long time before you can reopen them again. So there's a whole range of issues here that are massive challenges. And I guess if I have a personal reflection here, it's the frustration at identifying so many issues, giving some pointers at how we can address some of these things, enumerating some of them in terms of how important they are in the overall scheme of things, but still struggling even with our end users and practitioners out there to work out some really good ways we can tackle those. Okay, so my final slide, I just really would like to thank the rest of the team here and say a big thank you to others who've been involved, and of course to our end users who've been great support. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mel. A couple of questions for you. Was it a surprise to you or to the agencies that you were working with that this was such a prevalent behaviour and that the consequences were so rare, that it was a really normalised behaviour in Australia?
Yeah, it was a surprise. One was a surprise to our end users who, and our volunteers who are on the ground, who actually see how frequently these sorts of behaviours occur. I think what I was particularly pleased with from our research in some ways was actually that tip of the iceberg picture was where we actually got to see that even if people were recording something that had been probably a more salient event, it still had very little in the way of consequences. And so what really that means is that when it comes to looking at the number of people who get rescued by external groups, whether it's NRMA or the road service or garages, or whether it's actually the SES themselves, but actually, it's less than 1.5% of what we had in our sample actually get rescued. So if you're just doing an analysis on people who get rescued, you're still missing a whole heap of people who get away with it this time. And similarly with our research, looking at the fatalities, it really only gives us a very sort of small group of people who unfortunately lost their lives as a consequence of doing this. But it really only gives us part of the picture. So I think I'd certainly like to know more about the rescues and who we need to look at, who make those decisions and get caught out and do have consequences, because that would give us a little bit more information than we currently have.
You mentioned that some of the influencing factors were advanced driving courses and weekly driving hours. The question is, does that mean people are more likely or less likely to drive through the floodwater under those two determinants?
Sorry, okay. So people who attended an advanced driving course were more likely to drive through floodwater as well. And people who drove more hours typically also were more likely to drive through floodwater. So obviously, there are a number of issues here. So there's a whole lot of potential or exposure and opportunity, if you will, here. So obviously, the more you're on the road, the more opportunity you have to encounter floodwater. Potentially, the more time you have opportunity you have to drive through floodwater. But I think, we found, for example, that confidence in your ability to drive wasn't the key factor. It was these other things were stronger in predicting that behaviour.
How soon after an emergency can you use the concept, if it's flooded before, it'll happen again, without upsetting those previously impacted? You may not have an answer for that.
No, it's a tricky one. I think, finding that sweet spot to give you messaging is obviously something I'm very happy as an academic to leave to the practitioners. But there is a lot to be said for, I guess, preparing people for the next event when they're still listening, when they're still receptive. And obviously that means being sensitive to those who've been badly impacted. But for those who have just been exposed, they're primed, and it's not a bad time to try and get those messages in.
Oh, sorry about that. The question is around the statistical link between people remembering the campaigns and behaviour change. So is that one of the things you measured? So if they remembered the
Not-
campaign, are people less likely to drive through?
It didn't come out in our analysis. So remembering a campaign and potentially, if you want to extrapolate, being more engaged perhaps in communication in this area, wasn't something that predicted whether people were more or less likely to drive through floodwater. So it didn't seem to have an impact on behaviour in that context.
Okay.
But obviously appreciating that recall and specific recall of messages, is a crude way to get to that understanding, but it's still a way we can sort of attempt to find out if people do remember those sorts of messages.
A question asking about behaviour change. The research tends to advise not to use messaging about what not to do. Would a positive message like turn back be more effective than don't do it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and again gets to the heart of some issues here. I mean, we on the project and with our end users, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about that reinforcement of what not to do all the time, whether it's having a reporter stand in the water to tell you how dangerous it is to enter floodwater, whether it's showing endless footage of people driving through floodwater, telling people that it's not a good idea. Those contradictory cues are really troublesome from the point of view of behaviour. And indeed, in the last few weeks, it's been really interesting to see some of the work coming out on COVID and myth busting, and how actually repeating myths actually tends to make them seem more familiar, and because they're plausible, people believe or might believe them as a consequence of having heard them in myth busting. So I think, again, if we take that and extrapolate that into this context, seeing these images won't be reinforcing not to do them.
Yeah. Okay, that's problematic. More research needed. One last question. You articulated your definition of floodwater. In other words, if you couldn't see the road underneath. Was that the same definition as the people that you spoke to? How did they define floodwater?
A range of opinions in all of that. I mean, the definition we used for the survey was one we came up with in combination with our end users around how they would help to define floodwater. And definition is really tricky in all of this. Again, because it's so impacted by your location as well. So, as I said, still water on the road looks like a puddle. You drive through it, you get by, and it's not a problem. And you don't think of that as flood. So I think the public, as much as I can generalise from our sort of qualitative research, the public have perhaps more of a view of floodwater being more the raging rapids, perhaps, rather than the puddles. Whereas our experts appreciate, perhaps in a slightly more nuanced way, the risks that are associated with flow, with a shallow floodwater, or indeed floodwater that has some flow on it, which of course is different again.
Thank you so much for your time, Mel. Really interesting research and plenty more to do.